Okie dokie. I'm Michael Bain, and this is the Best Defense Survival, essentially our emergency roundtable during the course of this COVID-19 emergency that we're all going through here. With me, of course, is Mike Seeklander, Michael Chanich, Rob Pincus, possibility of Dr. William April joining us a little bit later in the show. But guys, I think at this point, we are in the belly of the beast. Everything that I've read, every article that I've read tells me that we are here. We are in the solid center of the epidemic now. And I think it's got people scared. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of talk on television, a lot of talk in the articles I've read. This is like, don't leave your home. This is it. You're standing right in the middle of the firestorm. Janich, Mr. Janich, what do you think? Is that consistent with what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people who have not really kind of embraced the reality yet, it's starting to really kind of settle in. Maybe there was some hopeful thinking there that there was, light at the end of the tunnel, or that this would be a shorter term thing that they had anticipated. But I think it's not just the timing and the fact that it's endured this long, but they're also seeing that, for example, the recommendation for everyone to wear face masks. That was something that I think for a lot of people, it's like, okay, this is another step toward the serious side of this. And they're just seeing things kind of stack up in a way where if they were more dismissive before, it's harder to maintain that dismissive mindset, and they've got to start taking it seriously. For the people who have had their heads in the game, I think they're just continuing to do the math, and they're saying, look, yeah, this is serious, and this is continuing to build. And as you said, we're in the belly of the beast.
Mr. Pincus?
I think in some ways it's like the person that gets mugged and says that they never thought it was going to happen to them, or they couldn't believe it was happening in the moment. It's like, well, how much evidence did you need that on Earth people get mugged? You're on Earth, you're people. This could happen to you. I really feel like some of that has been going on for a month. You're on Earth. There's a pandemic. It's going to affect you. You should be doing things to reduce the likelihood of transmission in your everyday life and in your behaviors. And some people are just waking up to that reality now that there's an order that says you should wear a mask, or that now that there are people who are actually being told, no, you can't come in the store because there's already 20 people in the store. You have to wait out here on this spot 6 feet away from everybody else before you can go in. Now, all of a sudden it's real. Obviously, we started this. This is now our fourth one. We started this several weeks ago. For some people, this has been real for weeks. For some people, it's probably been real for months is this going to affect things? Some people are just figuring it out this week. Frustrating, isn't it?
Mr. Seeklander, thoughts on where we are here in the center of the fire?
I would prefer not to label it maybe that harshly, although that's what it is. But I think that if you're in a situation where, okay, you're about to be in a fight, and then when you're in that fight, it's a fight. So, we said last week, we said, hey, next week is going to be telling. In our first meeting, we discussed what was going to be happening in April. We looked at the numbers, we discussed the numbers. And I think if anybody is surprised by this at this point in time, shame on them. They weren't listening to anything anybody's been putting out. I mean, this is not some big hoax. This is not some big political thing just because of the election. This is a real pandemic that's killing real people and has changed our planet in ways we probably couldn't imagine. I think we're exactly where we said we would be, in the previous weeks. And I've heard there's some other trends too, where there's some positive news where this thing is maybe not airborne. I saw a pretty motivating video earlier today from a doctor that was actually emotional because he was happy, because he realized if he could manage himself in a certain way, he was not going to get this stuff, assuming he wasn't laying on top of someone and they weren't breathing directly in his face. It's certainly interesting times.
I see a lot of positives. I mean, we're Rob, I don't know if you're back in Colorado, but the numbers out of Colorado look good. The numbers of new infections and certainly the number of deaths has started to flat and drop, which is certainly what we've been looking for. But I had to go out today because I think most of the people watching understand that all of us are, in effect, small business people. We are all running a whole series of small businesses, and things that had to go to Federal Express today. If I wanted to get paid, had to go to Federal Express today. And in going to Federal Express, one of the things I thought was interesting, I saw people jogging, I saw people biking in masks. I saw at the grocery stores, essentially they have now are enforcing social distancing. Lines on the sidewalk, people lined up 6, 7, 8 feet apart, and then as one person exits the store, the next person steps up to a decontamination center where they wash their hands, they clean their hands, they clean off the cart. They're all required to have masks, and then they're allowed in the store. So I was gratified by that. I was looking at it and said, wow, this is, what we need to kind of get this thing wrapped up here. Mr. Janich, have you been out? Have you been out this week?
I really haven't been out that much other than my neighborhood. We kind of stocked up big time last week based on the idea that things were going to be getting worse, or the presumption that they would. So other than being around in the neighborhood and everything, and you see neighbors, you greet neighbors from a distance, I would say that within my neighborhood, probably half the people I see are wearing masks. Within the past couple of days, that's gotten a little bit better, just as far as people kind of, following that protocol, but you still will see exceptions to the rule as well. My wife has actually been out a little bit more. She takes advantage of the early morning shopping hours for seniors, and I asked her how that went, and she said exactly what you just described. That it's very much, the stores have defined a protocol as far as letting people in, how the whole thing works, how they sanitize carts and everything else, and it really has become a very methodical process, which again I think is for a lot of people. I mean, even people who are doing kind of curbside pickup and everything, I've seen a lot of comments recently where people were like, hey, I ordered groceries, but now the wait used to be a couple days, 3 days, whatever. Now, depending on where you're ordering from, you may be 5, 6, 7 days out as far as availability of when you can pick up groceries. And that, I think, is also causing a paradigm shift for a lot of folks. They're like, wait a minute, I'm doing everything right, and even that is becoming more challenging, or it's becoming more regimented. So it's, I think people are, whether they like it or not, there's so many stimuli that are hitting them where it's like, this is different, this is different, this is different, and cumulatively those things now are forcing that mindset shift.
Mr. Pincus, let's talk about masks. I think when we first were on here, and I see that Dr. April has joined us. You're still alive in New Orleans. That's a plus. I think the first recommendations from the Center for Disease Control or from the government on masks don't work, I think that was a terrible mistake, because masks do work. They don't work great. It's not a panacea, but let's say a mask protects you 15% better than no mask at all in the face of a pandemic, in the face of dying. I'll take 15% any day of the week. Rob?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I am still in Florida. I'm going to Colorado. I'll be there in a few days. I think Colorado is a great example of a state that kind of went from not much from the government in terms of what you have to do or what you should do to all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of things that are put in place really quick over the last week to 10 days. And I think it's working out well there from what I see from afar, obviously with my daughter and other close friends there and things like that. I've been paying attention to it. The thing with the masks, I think I was actually hoping to address this, and I just pulled up to the studio here. All of my stuff is in the truck. Today's the first day that I wore what I'm going to call a face cover. I had to go to the bank today to do some specific business inside the bank, and the recommendations here are very strong in Northern Florida now for masks. It's not a government order, but a lot more people are doing it over the last few days since our stay-at-home order went into place Friday. So I now have a face cover. I think it's really important to distinguish between the face cover the next level of N95 mask, and then all the way to the respirators. I did clean shave again this morning around the goatee. I may even lose the goatee here before I head out to Colorado, because I think it's important to really distinguish between these face covers, which is really what the recommendation is cover your face so you don't cough or sneeze or expel spittle or droplets out, and a respirator, which is going to keep you potentially from getting the virus from somebody else. All of these things have to be worn and or used properly to have any effect. And as I understand it, and I do think I agree with this at some level, the idea that you were going to put on a scarf or put on a poorly worn N95 or put on a surgical mask and that it was going to protect you to some high degree from getting the virus from someone else was the concern of the CDC and other health organizations, that people were just going to, put a sock over their face, go out in public and act like everything was normal. And without the social distancing and without the controlled number of people in close spaces and without the lack of gathering and without all the other things we've put into place, that face covering or even surgical mask really wasn't going to do much good. So it was the idea of the false sense of complacency that masks that were in the general population might have had. I think that's why we heard those early recommendations that no, masks aren't going to help you. At this point of saturation and carriers, like I may be a carrier and not know it, wearing that face covering makes it less likely that I'm going to expel anything that's going to get onto a surface and somebody's going to touch, then they're going to touch their face and then they're going to get it. So there really is a couple of distinguishing issues on that topic that make it a little more complicated than all or nothing, yes or no on masks.
Dr. April, your thoughts there? One of the things that is very dangerous, I think, it seems to me, that when somebody at the very beginning, we say, well, no masks, they don't do any good. And then they say, well, now we really need you to wear a mask outside. Does that cause people to actually disregard a lot of really critical information?
Well, I think it plays into conspiracy thinking more than anything else. The time is ripe where people are now saying, well, why did they say that first point? There must have been some agenda, some nefarious agenda in play. I think it was more careless than anything else. But I think it gets right to the heart of the problem, as Rob was talking about. I think the vast majority of people outside wearing a mask still think the mask is to protect them. But with up to 20% asymptomatic positive people walking around, I think it would have been more helpful had they right up front said, listen, there's two tasks here. One is keep from getting sick. The other is make damn sure you're not getting anyone else sick. And so that would have been much more helpful from the start than just sort of a blanket denial. It was just sort of, oh, pish posh, those won't do anything for you. Well, but they'll do something good for somebody. And I think as an array of choices, it always works better. If you offer people an array of choices, here are things you can do that are generally good. The more of them you do, the better it is for you and for everyone else. That would have been a much more adult approach than having to stake out a kind of silly position and then backtrack from it.
Mr. Seeklander, what would you add on the mask question? Again, I started last week. What I am using is I have, again, as I mentioned last week, I have N95 respirators. And I'm using an N95 respirators with a scarf over it. And the reason is based on from some of my own medical sources. They said, hey, that's your best odds. The scarf is basically keeping away large particles, and the N95 respirator is keeping you from killing everybody around you, which
Sure.
is a real plus. But Seeklander, anything more to add on the whole mask question here?
No, I think Dr. April covered it very, very thoroughly. I wish it would have been said different in the beginning, but then again, I'm going to cut a lot of people making announcements and giving opinions a break, because I don't know if anybody at this point needs to play the blame game. Maybe we could say, hey, our government officials that were probably briefed on the potential for some of these pandemics years ago probably should have acted. As a country, we should have had a stock pool of masks. There's a lot of money that the government spends on a lot of things that probably could have went to really useful things. As we know, the government doesn't always do the right thing with money. But uniquely enough, from a defensive sort of mindset, the mask is a unique thing because, well, number one, I do think it completely protects other people from what you're expelling. I mean, that's the fact. The real truth is you could theoretically protect yourself and what you're breathing, but you touch something, you reach up and rub your eye, you're done. I mean, it transmits, from what I've been told, in the eyes too. So that completely negates that. I think, though, It's important to understand if we increase our percentage of not getting sick or getting someone else sick, that's good. If it's 1%, that's good. That's a good number that could add up in the long term. But more importantly, from a defensive standpoint, people with masks on, now you start to lose the ability to communicate on any level. Now, we're not supposed to get close to people, but now we're having a hard time reading body language and facial expressions and some of that human pleasantry where someone may give you a smile as they walk by is missing. Like I saw a bunch of people in Walmart the other day with a mask, and I'm not currently wearing one, mainly because I didn't have a big stockpile of them. That's one thing I missed in my preparation, and poo-poo on me. I should have known better. But it was weird because I saw a lot of people and I would make eye contact, but I couldn't tell what their facial expression was. I can't tell, you could tell when you see someone's facial expressions, the contortions of their mouth and stuff. Hey, they're irritated because you bumped their cart into them, or they're irritated because you pull out in front of them. Now, man, we're really left without a lot of those human cues and facial expressions and things like that. And I think that's kind of interesting as a society as well. I don't know where it'll play out, but it's certainly something that's different.
One thing too, Mr. Janich, that I am hearing and seeing kind of out of Colorado is a pretty precipitous increase in domestic violence, which we've talked about that before, but now now that we're in this tension spot, we're waiting to get to that peak. I believe the medical, the most current thinking in Colorado is the peak comes on 15 April. And, comes earlier, a few days later, a few days earlier, a few days later for New Orleans, for Louisiana, unfortunately, William. But, I am hearing and seeing in the police reports and seeing some of the local papers that we are seeing an increase in domestic violence. And have you given any thought, Janich, is there any way we can help head some of that off? Is there anything we can do?
That's tough. Because the situation, this is unprecedented, to be under stay-at-home orders that are this pervasive, that affect this many people. What it really comes down to is just like preparing, it becomes kind of an individual effort. The same thing when it comes to managing the interpersonal dynamics in your house. You have to kind of look at things and have a plan and say, okay, look, this is not the way we want things to be. But just like solving any other problem, we have to try to look at this stuff together. You have to figure out what sacrifices you're willing to make, take a look at the relationships that you're in, and be able to assess those relationships and kind of figure out, where the trigger points are. And, it's kind of a trial by fire for a lot of people who've always had that safety valve. Hey, my wife is pissing me off. I'm going to go get a beer someplace, or I'm going to go hang out with the guys. I'm going to go play pool, whatever it is. You had that safety valve where you could, create some distance, create some extreme social distance back in the day, and be able to let things cool down, kind of give yourself that mental break, and then come back with a clear mind and everything else. Now we don't have that same option in the same way, but we do have the ability to do that. We just have to figure out ways of achieving that effectively with fewer resources. Maybe just going to the other side of the house. Hey, I'm going to watch the TV in the den or something like that, or I'm going to watch something on YouTube or whatever it might be, and just take that time to have the break from people that you're kind of stuck in the same house with them. But you've got to come to that point where, you still address the problem. You just got to figure out what resources you have to work with within a more confined area now.
Mr. Minkus, Rob, I was thinking that almost what Mike is talking about there is applying the tools of de-escalation that we taught as de-escalation for potentially violent situations. It's almost applying the de-escalation rules to yourself. You're de-escalating yourself before you get to that breaking point. Rob?
Absolutely. I recognize, obviously, there's a huge span, a huge spectrum of domestic violence, and what we're talking about being ongoing abuse. Everything I'm about to say really doesn't apply. If you're in an abusive situation that's been ongoing and it's just now made worse by the stay-at-home orders, that's probably a different thing. if you're in what is an otherwise normal relationship or a healthy relationship, and now the close quarters and all the financial stress and the medical concerns and the family members you can't see, if all of those things are starting to build up, what I've been suggesting to people and what I think makes sense and what I personally have done, even in situations that have nothing to do with coronavirus, where, other things, whether it's a divorce or financial stress, are causing obvious tension, is you have to make those plans in what I would call the sober moment, not necessarily literally when you're not drinking, but in the moment of calm. It's really important to talk about that and just raise the issue, right? It's like everything else, preparation. If you recognize it in the moment, you're more likely to recognize it in the moment and respond in a reasonable way than you are if in the moment it shocks you and it catches you off guard that this person that you're living with or you're in this relationship with has now done something that crosses a line, and you improvise or you react emotionally. That's when we have this potential escalation. So if you can sit down with your partner, and this goes for not just husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, but for roommates, for the kids, for the any adult that's sharing this space with you, is you have a plan. Listen, if things get heated, safe space is a kind of a trigger word in gun world, right? But conceptually, that den or that bedroom or the walk-in closet, make it the designated safe space. Make it a timeout zone. Like when you were kids and you were playing tag, you can't get tugged when you're on when you're touching the big tree. Hey, I need to go to the closet. I need to go to the bedroom. I need to go to the den. And promise and commit to honor that request from the other person to get yourself a little time out. Take your face cover and make it an eye cover and put your ear pods in or your headphones in and just put on your favorite music, whatever it is. And probably not like death metal, maybe put on some Barry Manilow or something. Like, you can find a way to isolate yourself conceptually. You can find a way to get into a moment. Sorry about that, guys. But the idea to be able to put yourself in a position where you can isolate yourself, even though you're not physically distanced, like you would go to your buddy's house, or you'd go for a run, or you go to the bar, you go to the pool hall, go to the arcade, whatever that thing is. So I think setting up those markers in advance, just like we always talk about on The Best Defense, not in the moment of emergency, not in the moment of emotion, trying to figure out what to do and start spinning, but set it up in advance. And again, I think it's really important to communicate ahead of time. We all know that we are more stressed under these conditions than we would be normally. It's completely fair and valid to ask the people you're living with to have that meeting and have that consideration. And hopefully doing so will have you avoid a tragic escalation where everybody regrets some physical violence that happens, because these stresses are going to continue to mount on us, I think, in the next few weeks.
Dr. April, and you've dealt with interpersonal violence for a long time. We're in the pressure cooker. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a real uncomfortable reality that a great many of us are having to come to grips with. There are plenty of relationships out there where physical violence on an ongoing basis, to a greater or lesser degree, is part of the fabric of the relationship. For most people that are in a non-abusive relationship, they can't imagine crossing that line. But there are plenty of relationships where there has been physical violence in the past and likely will be some in the future. But what's changed now is that the mechanisms that are used to let off a little of the pressure to equilibrate in other ways are just not there. You can't leave and go hang out with your friends. You can't go, just get out of the house for a night. And so the things used to if you will, lower the heat are just not there. And so the only thing people have to discharge their anxiety is physical violence, that one-way street, largely a one-way street. And I think that's something that most of us don't think about. When you think about domestic violence, people start talking about safety plans and escape plans and where are you going to go. That's not really a factor in a lot of these ongoing abusive relationships. And so it's sort of that the pot is on the boil and being forced to stay on the boil to a certain extent. And that's pretty uncomfortable for the rest of us to contemplate.
One thing I was thinking about is in my own life here, and in the way we're dealing with it here at the Secret Hidden Bunker in the Rocky Mountains. I know this is going to actually sound silly, but we're all watching a lot of television, right? We're all we believe in Netflix USA. We believe in Amazon Prime, Hulu. I've started watching lighter-hearted things. I know that sounds amazingly trite, but it's kind of a real thing. is, you're sitting around and you're watching, I don't know, Secondhand Lions instead of The Walking Dead. What you come away with is a little bit of a lessened sense of pressure. Maybe that's something that people should think about, even if initially they think, well, that's really stupid. I really want to go watch I was Criminal Minds, and God knows I love Joe Mantegna, and I love the guys at Criminal Minds. But if you want to watch a Criminal Minds marathon at a time when you're already in a pressure cooker, Mr. Seeklander, do you think that's a great idea?
No, I think it's a fantastic idea, and once again, I don't mind relaying personal stories, and I'm gonna relay one about that, and then talk about the whole family violence thing. The Last Ship. There's a show on called The Last Ship. I love it. I fell in love with it two or 3 weeks ago. The problem is The Last Ship is about this Navy ship with this awesome captain and a cool crew that basically have to go to Antarctica or something to find the cure for this virus that has killed everybody on the planet, right? So we're about 2 weeks into this, and the wife finally says, I don't want to watch this anymore. I'm like, this is awesome series. I really like this, which brings me to the point that I totally agree with you, Mr. Bain. I think that's a very, very smart move. It's like we've been telling our kids forever that the crap you put in your ears, and I listened to some of the lyrics of some of the songs recently that my kids have, and I'm like, oh my God, we're letting them literally program their subconscious, to think a certain way. So what you look at and what you listen to, you absolutely need to lighten that up. And I said on the first show, 95.5 maybe, ignore 95% of the news you're seeing right now. You probably need about 5% to know what you need to know, right? There's a pandemic. You're in your house. You need food. You need security. You know what you know, right? You don't really need much beyond that. But the second point is, once again, and we had a comment about this, I think, via email. When my wife said, I don't want to watch it anymore, it surprised me. I'm like, why not? It's a good series. Well, because this thing was weighing very heavy on her. And I'll say it again for the listeners and the audience. It was weighing on her because her life is completely different. My life is much the same. Guess what? I work in an office from home. I go to a private range 2 or 3 days a week to film content or shoot or do whatever I want to do. I have access by myself or with my one coach to go to my MMA place. So everything that I normally do on my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is the same. And I didn't see that. So I didn't see that in that show. So I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, I have a wife, 3 kids, a poodle, a cat, and a lizard in this house. And I think that some of the advice that people need to remember is you have to have some sort of structure. I think Rob said it well as far as having a space in the home. Right now, we all have individual spaces where if I'm in here or my wife is where she's in front of her computer or in an area right now, she's actually meditating. And the kids have started this meditation stuff because they're all like, we're feeling some anxiety. We're not sleeping well. So we're being very, very proactive in that. And last but not least, in terms of family violence, if you can get it out, communicate. We're doing what I call hot washes where son asked me, hey, can we have a hot wash? And I'm like, why? He said, because I want to tell one of my siblings this or that. Hey, you got to communicate. And I'll close with this last thing, not to be loud. They make a thing called a Bob XL, right? Called a body opponent bag made by Century Martial Arts. Buy a Bob. And when you're feeling violent, go to the garage and beat the living dog piss out of Bob. I do it probably on a daily basis. And no, I don't visualize that's a family member. It's great cardiovascular exercise. So buy a Bob, beat a Bob.
Mr. Janich, I don't know if you saw the response we got from one of our viewers, but it actually moved me. It was a response from a man who, an RN, and who had been an emergency room RN, so right on the cutting edge. And what he said essentially was that, well, he understood this pandemic stuff. He understood the epidemic stuff. He understood social distancing, washing your hands. But in the things that we talked about in the last few weeks, he realized that what he wasn't doing was talking to his spouse. And he said, he goes, if you guys can suck it up and say, we have issues or there's issues we need to address with our own families, that it gave him what he actually said is it gave him the strength to sit down and say, I haven't been dealing with this fairly with you. So even we're talking about a lot of interpersonal things here, but I think the interpersonal things have become critical. Mike, what do you think?
I think that's exactly right. And last week when we talked about the idea of, admitting our own personal fears, admitting things that are of concern to us and everything, what it does is, first of all, it helps kind of as a pressure valve with regard to, what's going on inside your own head, being able to express that to the people who are most important in your life and doing it in a way where you're cultivating an understanding of each other's what's going through each other's heads. But at the same time, you're also, I think, becoming more identifiable to the people that are important in your life. They understand who you are better. And the more that you can share those types of things, like somebody who's been an emergency room nurse or somebody who's been a cop or, dealt with any kind of the really challenging aspects of what happened in life, you can see those people would shut stuff down. You're not going to bring something home and say, oh yeah, we had this guy come in today and he died in the emergency room. That's not a, happy, how was your day, honey, type of thing to share. So people tend to shut that stuff down. And when you get into that mindset, when you get into that habit of not sharing that stuff, that's something that sticks with you because the habits are what they are. When you can kind of break that, and be able to communicate better, be able to get people to understand you better, be able to understand what's going on inside your head, and you taking the time to understand what's going on inside of their heads. I mean, that communication is what cultivates relationships. That communication is what builds relationships, and it also builds tolerance at a time when we need it most.
Rob, one of the things that we've done here is respect the closed door. If I close the door to my office, or my sweetie, who has an office on the opposite side of the house, closes the door to her office, my assumption there is that she needs a little bit of time alone. And that whatever she's focusing on, she needs to 100%, which happen to be corporate taxes today. But I think that's an important point, that it's to respect the other people in your space.
Absolutely. And we're starting to pick up on, I think, other people's cues. Like Seek was talking about how it's hard to read body language, facial expression as much as it is without a mask, obviously. That being said, I think that we as a species and as people, we talked in one of the early episodes about situational awareness and what's a normal situation and what's an anomaly, all of that shifting. I think very quickly we're starting to pick up on what that new normal is in terms of body language and proxemics and things like that. Inside of our home and outside of our home. I made a post before, maybe 2 hours ago, before we started this session, about coronavirus killing chivalry. Right? I have caught myself in a few separate episodes just in the last couple of days being totally kind of uncomfortable and caught off guard and awkward by what I would normally do as just normal way of life. Right? One was holding a door for a woman. She clearly stopped. She didn't know how to respond in terms of being uncomfortable walking within 6 feet of me while I was holding the door. And I kind of jokingly, I kind of looked down and said, I'll hold my breath. Just come on in. And she went by. I was in line at a hardware store on the 6 feet marks. A woman dropped something, and I just about blew my knee out. My reflexive to stoop. I squat to go grab what she dropped, and then immediately stopping myself because that could have even been seen as, an offense to her, that I would dare to contaminate whatever it was she had. And then exactly the same thing happened. I was getting the oil changed in the truck today, and when in the outside waiting area, there was a woman with like a 4 or 5 year old sitting on her lap. They were doing some homeschooling work. There's a tablet, paperwork, and something blew off the ground, or blew off the table to the ground, and she was trying to reach it, and she was clearly going to have to take the kid off her lap, and the kid didn't want to let go. And I said, if you don't mind, I'll get that for you. I just don't know what the rules are right now. Like how do you want me to do it? And kind of laughed about it. But there are these real social changes that are happening in public that we talked about, somebody being next to you on the phone or looking at a shopping list, realizing they're close to you, rapidly moving away. Might normally a rapid movement in close proximity, you might be seen as a threat. Here's someone trying to de-escalate what they consider a potential physical threat. There's all these things we have to get used to. I think it's really important that we accept the changes as being need to be made, and again, prepare ourselves ahead of time. Things are going to be awkward when we're interacting in public. Things are going to be awkward potentially inside of those rooms. And again, that comes back to that communication. I said earlier, not death metal, but Barry Manilow, and it's everything you guys were talking about as far as that happy stuff, right? When I drive, I listen to the news, I cycle through the news channels, but I've been going to Sirius XM 105, channel 105 for guys in our age bracket. Just a great turn your brain off. It's the Johnny Carson monologues and interviews with people from the 70s and 80s. A great just turn your brain off and laugh a little.
Dr. April, it sounds like we're trying to build a new set of baselines for society, and we're really not sure how to do that.
Well, so I think it's important to remember that some of the behavior that seems inexplicable. I mean, if you look at the Netflix front page and it says popular in America today, Outbreak, the movie Outbreak has been basically pinned to one of the top positions on that list, which seems bizarre until you think about its real psychological function. Watching a movie about a pandemic allows us to discharge some of our own anxiety. It might be uncomfortable for me to turn to someone and say, wow, I am really scared. But to sympathize with Dustin Hoffman and worry that he's going to die in the story allows us to discharge those same kinds of feelings in a safe context, because we know the movie's going to wrap up in a pretty positive way, by the end of the 2 hours. And so that willing suspension of disbelief and entering into that narrative allows us to kind of get outside ourselves and watch the similar circumstance that we're in, watch that similar circumstance get resolved. And it lets us feel that. It gives us a sense of relief. So I'm not opposed to it, and it does have a positive function, unless it becomes the only thing that you can watch and the only thing that interests you and your only way of discharging anxiety.
It almost sounds like where you see in the psychologist's office and they're holding the little doll and say, point it where he touched you, point it where it hurts, or something like that. William, if I could stick with you for just a second, where are we on increases in violence? Not in terms of domestic violence, but overall increasing violence out in the world.
Well, I don't think we're seeing, hordes of zombies, ravaging neighborhoods. It's just not there yet. I think there is enough of an ambient fear of going out that it's having an effect on everyone. But the regular street crime is still happening. There's some argument as to whether the rates are declining in particular places or not, but it's still happening. And there is a wave of new kind of violence that I find very distressing. It's violence committed by folks who've been released from detention for fear of getting coronavirus. And we recently had a case here in New Orleans where this was a relatively high leadership position, a guy in a local drug distribution gang was released from pretrial detention and promptly got murdered. So while it's easy to say, good riddance, that neighborhood was sprayed with machine gun fire, and no one else was killed other than the subject. But that's a kind of violence that neighborhood did not need to be exposed to. So that's a new kind of violence that we're seeing. And so the curve is just vertical on that kind of violence because it's never happened before. People have never been released from detention for contagion concerns. And so from zero, every number is straight up on that score.
Well, one thing, Rob, I promised I wouldn't talk about politics, but I think one thing that adds to the tension is what we almost see as this double standard, if you will, where an article out of San Francisco, I have a lot of friends in San Francisco, and it's a city I once loved, and now I wouldn't go in on a bet. But where in Los Angeles, San Francisco, the people on the street, the homeless, essentially none of this applies to them. That there's none of the rules apply to them, but they apply to the people who follow the rules. And I think, do you think that's adding to tension? I mean, what I don't want to do is have somebody say, well, Michael Bain said da 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 da, so I'm gonna go out and hug my neighbor, or I'm gonna break social distancing. That's not what I mean, but there's still pressure from that, Rob.
There is, and it's definitely, on the one hand, I think it's a venting, it's a release for people to say, well, I'm going to focus on the politics of this. I think conspiracy theories to me are, people who realize they can't control something may or may not understand really the root causes or what's going on at all. So they jump to some, ridiculous, in many cases, explanation that reaffirms that they're pawns in some other players' games, and that we all need to be aware of this. And I see a lot of that. I've seen a lot of that, for decades in different ways, and now it's around coronavirus. So it's a typical human behavior. I think part of it is a coping mechanism. I think it's hard to say I don't know, and it's okay that I don't know. We will all figure this out. Humans will figure this out. And there's other humans that are in better position to figure out coronavirus than I am. So I'm going to let them do it while I do what I can. That's not always easy. When you start going too far down the path of finding simple explanations for really, really complex things, you might make bad decisions if you start believing those simple explanations. And that is what I'm concerned about. And I've said that from the politics side. The people, especially in the Second Amendment community, who have been on this angst edge, especially building up the 2020 elections of, I will not comply. It's a great bumper sticker, no compromises. It's a great, marketing campaign. But the reality is most people in the Second Amendment community do comply and do compromise just by going through a background check, by having a concealed carry permit, by not walking up to the capital of your state with a non-registered SBR and saying, hey, I'm being civilly disobedient. This is illegal, but I'm okay with that. I will not comply. People don't really do that, right? So now all of a sudden we've got this thing going on in the back of our heads, and here's this stay home order, and we've got this I will not comply culture. And I think a lot of people honestly are having like a crisis of faith because they've been saying, I will not comply, I will not comply, I will not comply, but they realize maybe it's in their best interest in this case to comply, and that is causing some stress, and certainly there's a lot of venting online about it.
Michael Janich, I've been trying to, in my own post, separate things out to say, okay, I am unconditionally agreeing on the social distancing as being in a high-risk group. I'm agreeing with the masking. I'm agreeing with all that. But at the same time, I am profoundly concerned with, in many ways, governments, especially local governments, are chewing away at liberty. And I'm also concerned about models. Every day the model changes. And I think if there are people who are following the news closely, it's got to be like whiplash, the models. If you could, Michael Janich, talk a little about models, because we've talked about it together before. I mean, models are just every bit as good as their assumptions and what you fill in the blank with.
True. I think, going back to some of what Rob said, as far as when you look at the idea of people complying in general terms, as far as like, this is what we need to do in this particular circumstance. It's like everything else that we do when we're decision making. We try to take in as much input as we possibly can. We try to evaluate that input based on our what our priorities are, what our values are, and everything else. And then we try to make decisions that we feel are in our best interest and are in keeping with our personal philosophies, our personal beliefs, and everything else. This overall situation is really challenging because what we have is the shifting sands of, okay, we thought we had this arena that we were working in before. We have this political, working up to the election and everything else. This is what I believe. This is what I'm going to stand for. This is what I'm going to do. And you have this mindset that represents who you are philosophically, who you are politically, and everything else. And now you put this pandemic on top of it and say, okay, well, wait a minute, things are changing now. So all the things that I thought that I knew and I thought that I stood for, some of those things I'm actually going to actively compromise a bit, because I can't just be outspoken and say, okay, pry this gun from my cold dead fingers. It's not pry this gun from my N95 mask. You look at it and you say, okay, there's some things that I am going to play along. I'm going to compromise. I'm going to do what the government tells me to do, even though deep in my heart, I consider myself, well, I'm, screw the government. I'm not going to play along. So it becomes, in many ways, it's good because it forces us to think through what our real feelings are, think through what our real values are, and to actually make conscious decisions in a lot of cases, rather than a knee-jerk reaction to, well, this is the way I think because I identify as this person or this element of society or whatever it is. In a lot of cases, it also creates even more angst when we look at, all the things that we're concerned about these days. Now it's like, well, damn, before I knew what to say because I had already decided who I was as a person and I had all my pat responses. If this issue came up, I would say this. Now, I don't know. We're actually redefining who we are.
That's a really interesting point. Mr. Seeklander, you look like you wanted to jump in there.
I don't know if I would jump in, but I just find it interesting that sometimes we have to discuss, like, what are we going to do in terms of compliance? What is right or what is wrong? How much should we support that our government is giving us? Because I think that right now, I think every human on the planet, to include the government to an extent, is going, hey, we want to end this thing. We want to save lives and we want to stop it because it's financially going to bleed us very, very badly. I think that maybe if we want to look at, anything in detail with our additional time, you want to spend your time wisely. Like I said earlier, figure out what you can do versus you can't do, find a way to train and do all that stuff. But beyond that, maybe we spend some more time actually looking into, like the stimulus packages, the initial stimulus package. And then there's the argument. I know most humans that are working full time don't probably have time to get online and research and read some of these bills or packages or whatever else to find out what kind of earmark money's in there, what kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, fluff money or crap is it. And I think that's something every citizen should be doing right now, is looking at what they're actually doing to lead us and to provide that stimulus, and what kind of stupid funding for whatever project that has nothing to do with this pandemic, just because they want to fund something, because there's always something being attached to this, to bill. I think that'd be a great use of people's time, to really take some time and research that kind of stuff and look into it. Because honestly, at that point in time, you could truly start to hold your government accountable, and you can understand it versus going, okay, I really don't have time for this because I work 60 hours a week. Guess what? You're probably at home online. So take that time to educate yourself and, make educated decisions.
It's a very good point. We're coming up on about an hour now, Rob. Maybe if we could kind of sum up what we can tell people to be thinking about next week or doing next week. One thing that struck me is that since we are in the heart of the virus, if you have to go to the store, I would suggest maybe there's usually now limits on what you can purchase. I'm not saying hoard, but instead of buying 1 can of tomatoes, maybe buy 2. Instead of buying a quart of milk, buy half a gallon of milk, because it's going to save you the next trip to the store. But just something to think about. Rob, is there anything on your mind that you would like to tell people to do as we go forward for this next week?
That's been my big messaging, and some of the daily stuff and the live stuff I've been doing is just, now is definitely the time to limit your exposure to other human beings, right? Try to minimize that as much as you can. We've talked a lot about the idea that as long as the stores are open and the electricity's on and the freezer is working, now isn't the time to dig into your stockpile. My guess is anybody who's watching the 4th episode of this and watches any of us or all of us when we speak on these topics probably has been doing those things to make sure they have the 1 week or the 2 week preferably gap, so that the day the stores close, the day the electricity goes out, the day that the roads are going to have checkpoints, that now you've got your week or 2 where you don't have to leave. I think this is now the time. If you've got the 72 week, dried, packed away MRE stuff, and you've got the 2 weeks that you could scratch by, I'd say use a week of that now. Take this opportunity to go a week without leaving your house if you can. Don't go down to the last bean, but see what you can do with rationing. And it might just be good practice. It might be good practice with your family to see what you can really do when you start rationing and really thinking about calories and proteins and vitamins and what do you really have and what can you do with it on a minimalist basis. Maybe this is the week to try that exercise.
Dr. April, looking out over that 7-day horizon until next Wednesday, what are the specific points you want to tell people?
Well, I think it's important to recognize the appeal of the crazy, as strange as it sounds. The belief in conspiracy theories and the belief in some hidden truths about this has an enduring appeal. And what that appeal gives us is resolution of uncertainty. I think the most aversive human emotion is uncertainty. And people will pick terror over uncertainty 7 days a week. And so at least if I believe that lizard people or Illuminati or something is behind this, I now know. I don't have to wonder and worry anymore. And so we have to be cautious. There's a drive within us to trade truth for a moment of certainty. We've got to recognize that and recognize that the drive to cling on to something, even if abjectly bizarre, is not a mystery. Fundamental human nature, and we have to watch out for our own tendency to believe anything just to feel better.
Mr. Janich, 7 days out, what do people need to be doing, thinking, planning for? What are the words you want to leave them with?
I think what you were saying as far as like buying that second can of something, just whatever you're doing right now, ideally you've been topping off, you've been, maintaining whatever you need to do as far as being able to live day to day, but also looking forward to the future. I think everyone has kind of wrapped their heads around how things have changed, how things are different today than they were a month ago or 6 weeks ago or whatever it is. Really kind of look at, okay, what options do I have right now, and how do I extend that reasonably beyond what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, or going to the store every 2 or 3 days or whatever it might be, and just say, okay, yeah, let me take that extra step. Let me prepare a little bit more, because if you're watching the numbers, if you're paying attention to the predictions as far as, we're in that crescendo, we're hitting that climb to the peak. And then you say, okay, let me just do a little bit extra. Let me prepare a little bit more and do it in, again, a reasonable way, not an alarmist way, not in a way that's going to screw anybody else by clearing off the shelves. But it just allows you to kind of bolster your resources just a little bit more. And really in the process, also look at, okay, what resources do I have and how much am I using? Just like a financial budget, you kind of figure out what you spend, what do you actually eat? One of the things that is different for people, I think, right now, being at home, I've talked to a lot of people on the phone and Skype and everything else where they're like, I really need to get exercising, because now that I'm sitting at home, I'm right next to the pantry. I'm constantly grabbing a bag of chips, or I'm grabbing this or whatever. That also changes the rate at which you consume the stuff that you have. So I'd also recommend that people really kind of figure out what their budget is as far as food, what they're actually consuming now that they're all stuck at home, and just kind of going back to doing the math, and then just kind of bolster things a little bit so that you're preparing for that eventuality that when things do peak, you're not going to go out at all, and be prepared for that.
Michael Seeklander, thoughts for the next 7 days?
First of all, I hope that when we get together again, if it's in a week or whatever, I would hope we could start to see a trend of good news and some flatlining. So I'm going to make that prediction. I hope I'm not wrong. I think people have done, honestly, a pretty good job. I mean, the stores in my area all have the same distance markers. Like, you're not supposed to, they're marked. Everybody's doing drive-through. They're accomplishing some amazing things in a very short period of time. So my hat is off to all those folks. I certainly want to shout out to the law enforcement and anybody in the medical field are doing this stuff. By the way, law enforcement, they're in the middle of a storm right now. I've talked to 3 or 4 good friends. Domestic violence is absolutely up, and it's going to get worse. When first of all, the heat of the summer's coming. People are going to continue to have less money. Those things are going to be big. So I'm going to start with my last point. Watch out for the after effects of this thing. This may flatline or maybe peak, or maybe it'll take longer, but I guarantee there are going to be some after effects that are potentially super dangerous. Domestic violence, we talked about that, but not just that, but folks that can't feed themselves and don't have money, or that know that there are a diminished police response out there. Be prepared to defend yourself. Once again, research all that stuff. And last but not least, structure your day. If you haven't done it, if you listen to our first show or second show, and I talked about this, structure your day. It needs to include fitness. It needs to include some sort of project or something you want to accomplish. Why not get it done? Because the back end of this year is going to be just crammed trying to catch up with all of the other things. Learn something every day. There's a bunch of free online courses, YouTube, whatever it is. Pick something to learn on a daily basis. And, don't forget to reach out to those loved ones. We talked about that, and, the potential for suicide. Hey, start to ping people. Get on the phone. send them a text message, get on Facebook, whatever you got to do, start to reach out and check on people and find out how they're actually doing. Because, you know, there might be someone that needs your help. And if you don't reach out to them, you're not going to know that. So.
Once again, guys, thank you, Michael Janich, Mike Seeklander, Dr. William April, Rob Pincus, and thank all of you for joining us here at Best Defense Survival. I found a quote that I thought was kind of germane in especially this particular time. It is from Martin Luther, and it's from 1527. And same thing, they're facing epidemics, facing pandemics at that time, and believe me, it was a lot worse. And Martin Luther said, I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me. So even if you go back to 1527, the way they fought that pandemic was the way we're fighting that pandemic today. So anyway, this is the Best Defense Survival, our roundtable during the COVID emergency. I am Michael Bain, and we will see you next week.